If you would please present the colors. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Jordan Pruitt singing our national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you. Please be seated. Before we continue today, there are a number of special guests that we have with us that I'd like to recognize, and I would like to start with our terrific Congressman Elton Gallagly and his wife Janice. Elton, thank you for coming. Speaking of congressmen, California Congressman from the 49th District and soon to be chairman of the House Government Oversight and Reform Committee, Darrell Issa. Thank you, Congressman. The wife and daughter of Gregory Peck, Mrs. Veronique Peck and Cecilia Peck. Early next year, the USPS will be unveiling a stamp in Mr. Peck's honor. From the city of Simi Valley, Mayor Bob Huber, City Manager Mike Siddell, and Council Member Mike Judge. I think I saw Ventura County Supervisor Peter Floyd come. Peter? Okay. Ventura County Clerk Mark Lund. Right. And the ever-present Duke Blackwood, the director of the Reagan Library. Duke. So we are gathered here today to honor the legacy of our 40th President, Ronald Reagan. As the centennial of his birth approaches, Plans are underway at the Reagan Foundation for a host of activities befitting of his legacy. For 2 years, we have been planning a series of events and educational programs around the world designed to remind people of one simple fact, that Ronald Reagan, a champion of American exceptionalism, inspired freedom and changed the world. Now, in just over 2 weeks, a Ronald Reagan-themed float will ring in the new year and be seen by over 50 million Americans in the upcoming 2011 Tournament of Roses Parade. We are very fortunate to have with us today the entire Tournament of Roses court, including Rose Queen Evan Friedman, Tatiana Barrios, Sarah Fredrickson, Jessica Montoya, Tanaya Senzaki, Katie Thompson, and Michelle Washington. Ladies, would you all please stand? Thank you for coming with us today. Thank you. Additionally, during the centennial, academic conferences at major universities from coast to coast, from USC to UVA to Notre Dame, will focus on key aspects of the Reagan presidency. A coin with President Reagan's image will be sent to all 14,000 high schools in the nation, 300 Division I NCAA schools, and every NFL team to be tossed at the opening of their football games next September in commemoration of the president. Statue unveilings and celebrations in his honor will occur around the world, from Washington, D.C. at Reagan Airport to Grosvenor Square in London, and across Central and Eastern Europe from Berlin to Prague to Budapest, where President Reagan's vision of freedom left an indelible mark on the world. Hundreds of students will receive college scholarships over the next 10 years through the rollout of the GE Reagan College Scholarship Program. And of course, the total renovation of the original Reagan Museum will be unveiled here at the Reagan Library on February 6, 2011, the President's birthday. Now, I have introduced a lot of people from the stage before. This one is a real honor. Everyone here, without exception, has joined us today because of their great admiration for President Reagan and to have the honor of being able to say, well, I was there when the Centennial Stamp was unveiled. I am also sure that everyone here, without exception, has also come to pay tribute to a remarkable former First Lady and my boss, Nancy Reagan. I also want to make sure that everyone here, without exception, understands what an honor it is to have Jim Miller with us. Many of you may well know of Jim's service as a member of the Board of Governors for the U.S. Postal Service since appointed there by President Bush in 2003. Jim served as chairman of that board from 2005 until 2008. But what I hope you will also remember about Jim Miller after you leave today are three other things. The first is that what we are unveiling today literally would not have been possible without Jim's leadership. I know that it often sounds trite to say something like that, but believe me, in this case, it is an absolute certainty. As I noted, we will do many things, terrific things, during the celebration of the centennial of our 40th president in the coming months. But it is Jim Miller that made the very first act, the unveiling of this stamp to honor Ronald Reagan during his centennial, a reality. We called on him in the 11th hour, and with very little expectation that this stamp could be approved in time for the centennial. And as usual, Jim came through for President Reagan in flying colors. The second thing I hope that we all remember about Jim is that, from what I can tell, he is entering his last year of service with the Postal Service. While this may be one of his last official acts as governor of the Postal Service, in our view, it is his most important. Jim, thank you for doing this. Finally, and this is coming from a former staff member on the House Budget Committee in Congress who watched Jim from afar, during his days with President Reagan as chairman of the FTC and as director of the Office of Management and Budget, I hope that above all, we remember his extraordinary service to President Reagan and our country during that time. President Reagan himself said of Jim, quote, "He made an outstanding contribution to our administration and our nation. He played a leading role in removing the shackles of excessive regulation from our economy, and I believe a great deal of the credit for our recovery goes to Jim." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. James Miller.
Good morning, and thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. Ms. Reagan, Governor Barnett, Ms. Pruitt, Mr. Forbes, distinguished guests. I started to say, and ladies and gentlemen, but everyone here is a distinguished guest. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to represent at this ceremony the Board of Governors, the Postmaster General, Pat Donahoe, the other officers, and almost 600,000 employees of the U.S. Postal Service. It's also an honor and pleasure for me to stand in for all of my colleagues, former colleagues like Jack Svahn I saw, colleagues in the Reagan administration, who to this very day get lumps in their throats and tears in their eyes whenever they see a clip of Ronald Reagan. This stamp honors President Ronald Wilson Reagan, and it does so by celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth in Illinois. It also honors Reagan's America, that shining city on a hill, that indefatigable spirit that no task is too much for us Americans, that sunny-faced optimism that has led us through the centuries. The stamp artwork is by Bart Forbes of Plano, Texas, who's here on the stage, and it's based on a photo of the president taken at the ranch in 1985. Oh my, how he loved that ranch, and how marvelously Mr. Forbes has captured the essence of the man. You know, this is such a wonderful stamp that you're about to see. If I have my way about it, the Ronald Reagan Centennial Stamp will be a forever stamp. All across America, helped by a bill passed by Congress and signed by President Obama, people are celebrating the centennial of President Reagan's birth. What made him so special? After all, he didn't follow the usual path of being educated at elite schools, going into public service, and then being elected president. No, he graduated from Eureka College, worked in radio, served in the armed forces, went to Hollywood, became an actor and a union president, then hosted a TV show and worked for General Electric before being drafted to run for governor of California. Now, several things made Ronald Reagan special. He had a deep, abiding faith in God and a belief that he was put here for a purpose, especially after the assassination attempt that almost took his life. He had an extraordinary trust in the goodness and the good sense of the American people. Frequently said, "You won't go wrong trusting the American people." He appreciated the good work that governments can do, but he was wary of concentrating too much power in governments. He believed there was a right and a wrong in the world. And in the 1980s, he believed the greatest wrong in the world was authoritarian communism. He also, by the way, viewed MAD, the defense policy known as mutually assured defense, as an avoidable evil and sought nuclear disarmament and missile defense. Reagan was effective for other reasons. For one thing, he could focus on overreaching goals with laser precision. And when he was forced to compromise with Congress, he'd say, privately to some people, publicly to others, "Thanks for half the loaf. Next year I'll be back for the other half." The president usually got what he wanted, in part because he was the great communicator. I once asked the head of the White House Office of Communications what it was like to have that role for President Reagan. "Piece of cake," was the answer. One thing that sustained President Reagan and most everyone else was his sense of humor. In one of his first cabinet meetings, the topic was whether he should sign an executive order allowing economic development in federal land's pristine wilderness areas. Now, those around the cabinet table spoke affirmatively for the proposition, but it was clear that the president wasn't persuaded. So in a last-ditch attempt to change his mind, the Secretary of Energy, Jim Edwards, said, "Mr. President, I still don't understand why bears need cleaner air to breathe than us humans." Well, without missing a beat, the president said, "Jim, you ever smelled a bear?" One time when he was about to step from behind the curtain to give a speech, President Reagan turned to me and said, "Jim, you know the last thing you do before you walk out on stage?" Oh my gosh, I thought, this is a test, oh my. I said, "Go to the bathroom?" He said, "Close." He said, "Check your fly, always check your fly." Or when he and his staff would be waiting for something was delayed, he'd start calling a baseball game just like he did at WHO out in Des Moines, Iowa during the 1930s. You see, at that time, radio stations didn't get an audio feed from the game, much less video. They got a teletype, and the teletype had this kind of code on there, and that's what the announcers used to tell about the game. The president delighted in telling about how one time the teletype broke down and he had to continue broadcasting the game, making up things as he went along. There were arguments between managers and umpires. There was a rain delay. Someone ran on the field, I don't know, naked or not, I don't know. All until the teletype resumed and he had to make up how quickly the innings had passed and how the scores had changed. President Reagan didn't reserve his humor for Americans only. At one summit, he told General Secretary Gorbachev that he had it on good authority that once Gorbachev was out at his dacha and was called back for an emergency meeting at the Kremlin. Unhappy that his driver wasn't making faster progress, he told him to pull over, and Gorbachev got behind the wheel. Now, this was President Reagan tell Secretary Gorbachev this. As they sped through the outskirts of Moscow, two motorcycle policemen pulled him over, speeding. And one went to the driver's window. Almost immediately, he returned to his comrade, visibly shaken. "Who was that?" said the one waiting. "I don't know," said the shaken policeman, "but he's got Gorbachev as a driver." There's simply not enough time to explore all the reasons President Reagan succeeded, why he's revered by so many, and why we are celebrating his birth and life today. Perhaps it is no more complicated than it was difficult not to like President Reagan. For with President Reagan, what you saw was what you got: humble, honest, and trustworthy. And perhaps that alone made him a great leader. As many of you know, President Reagan was a prodigious writer. I mean writing by hand. He didn't use a typewriter or a computer. At least I never saw one in the Oval Office, never saw him use a typewriter. As we now know from that splendid volume in his own hand, from the Reagan Diaries, from the First Lady's "I Love You, Ronnie," and from the touching letter to his fellow Americans telling him of his Alzheimer's, President Reagan wrote with a flowing prose and a wonderfully legible hand. President Reagan wrote notes to staff, some of my precious possessions, letters to world leaders, responses to Americans who wrote him. In fact, the correspondence office at the White House was directed to give him a sample every week of the tens of thousands of letters he received at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And he answered most of them that he received by hand. And he relied on the U.S. Postal Service to deliver every one of them. Now I ask Mrs. Reagan, Governor Barnett, Mr. Highbush, Ms. Pruitt, and Mr. Forbes if they won't join me at the stamp location as we unveil the stamp celebrating the life, times, and America of President Ronald Wilson Reagan.
If I could ask the Rose Court to come up for a photo, that would be terrific. Thank you. Okay. Okay, well, they are finishing their photos. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you all so much for coming out today. Please enjoy your afternoon, and if you would, if we could just ask you all please to give Mrs. Reagan a chance to exit this way as she leaves, we'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for coming.